The stone grinding wheel was halfway out of its housing when Daniel Foster's 10-year-old daughter Emma noticed the gap in the foundation wall, a space too regular to be accidental wear, too deliberately concealed to be original construction. She'd been sorting through rusted gears and pulleys while Daniel worked to extract salvageable materials from the abandoned grist mill, their breath showing in clouds in the November cold, both of them understanding without saying it that this $465 gamble was all that stood between them and eviction from the apartment they could no longer afford. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Dad, there's something weird here, Emma said, her voice carrying the careful tone she used when she wasn't certain if what she'd found mattered or was just another curiosity in a building full of abandoned industrial artifacts. Daniel set down the pry bar he'd been using, his muscles grateful for the break after 3 hours of dismantling equipment built to last centuries. He crossed to where Emma stood near the mill's main grinding floor, where the massive stone wheels had once turned day after day, crushing grain into flour that fed communities across 3 counties. The mill had been closed since 1982, had sat empty for 43 years accumulating decay and the particular silence that comes to buildings when their purpose ends. The gap Emma had found was maybe 6 inches wide, running vertically along what should have been solid foundation stone. Daniel shined his flashlight into the opening, seeing not the dirt and rubble he expected but worked stone, the kind of deliberate construction that suggested someone had built a space within the foundation itself. He worked the pry bar into the gap, applying leverage carefully, feeling mortar that had been dry for decades crack and give way. The stone facing came away in sections, revealing a door frame that had been covered so completely that time itself had nearly erased evidence of its existence. Behind the false wall was a heavy wooden door, its surface marked with a symbol Daniel recognized from historical markers around the county, the merchant's mark of the Whitmore family, who'd built and operated the mill for 4 generations before economic changes made small-scale grain milling obsolete. The door's lock was old-fashioned but substantial, the kind that would have required a specific key or considerable force to breach. Daniel was examining it, trying to decide whether forcing entry was justified when he had no idea what lay beyond, when Emma pointed to something carved into the stone above the door frame. Letters worn smooth by time but still legible in the flashlight beam, for whoever inherits what the earth provides. Daniel felt his pulse quicken with the possibility of discovery, with the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, this mill he'd bought for salvage might contain something more valuable than industrial scrap metal. He'd spent $465, nearly everything left after paying last month's rent, on property nobody else wanted, calculating that if he worked carefully he could salvage equipment and architectural materials worth $3,000, enough to keep him and Emma housed and fed while he searched for work that didn't exist in a county where the lumber mill had closed and the furniture factory had moved operations overseas. He was a carpenter by training, had spent 15 years doing finish work and custom cabinetry before the construction industry collapsed and took his job with it. His wife Laura had left 2 years ago, couldn't handle the financial pressure and the small-town isolation and the reality that Daniel's skills weren't valued in an economy that had moved beyond what he knew how to do. She'd gone to Atlanta seeking opportunity and had never come back, leaving Emma with the kind of abandonment wound that manifested as careful self-sufficiency, as determination not to be a burden, as the watchfulness of children who've learned that adults sometimes disappear when circumstances get hard. The lock resisted but eventually gave way to the pry bar's leverage, its mechanism failing after decades of disuse. The door swung open with resistance, hinges protesting, revealing a chamber maybe 10 feet square carved into the mill's foundation. Daniel's flashlight beam swept across stone walls, across wooden shelves, across something that made his breath catch, stacks of metal boxes arranged with the kind of precision that suggested importance, that implied whatever lay within mattered enough to seal away and hide with care. Emma stepped into the chamber behind him, her smaller flashlight adding illumination. "What is all this?" Daniel approached the nearest box, finding it sealed with wax that had cracked with age but had apparently done its job of keeping moisture out. He opened it carefully, his hands trembling slightly, revealing contents that made him understand immediately why someone had gone to such lengths to conceal this chamber. Not just currency, though there was plenty of that, old bills stacked and bound with paper bands noting dates and amounts. but also ledgers, documents, what appeared to be legal papers and correspondence, all preserved with the kind of care that suggested testimony rather than simple storage. A leather-bound journal sat atop one stack, its cover marked with the same Whitmore merchant's mark that had been on the door. Daniel opened it carefully, finding pages filled with precise handwriting, dated entries that began in 1978 and continued through early 1982. The first entry made his purpose clear: "My name is Charles Whitmore, and I am the last of my family to operate this mill. I am sealing this chamber because what I've learned about how the mill's fortune was built demands acknowledgement that I lack the courage to speak while alive. This money represents 4 generations of Whitmore prosperity, but it was earned through practices that I can no longer justify or ignore." Daniel read further, Emma reading over his shoulder, both of them processing information that transformed the chamber from simple storage to something far more complicated. Charles Whitmore had spent his final years documenting how his family's mill had prospered through the Depression and the wars by systematically underpaying the farmers who brought grain for milling, by manipulating weights and measures, by taking advantage of people who had no alternative processors and no means to challenge the Whitmore's calculations. The mill took a percentage of each farmer's grain as payment for processing, Charles had written. That was standard practice, accepted and understood. But my grandfather and father adjusted the percentage based on who they were dealing with, taking more from farmers who were poor or uneducated or black, taking less from those who had resources to verify the count or connections to complain to authorities. Over decades, this added up to substantial wealth extracted from people who could least afford to lose it. The journal continued with meticulous detail, naming farmers who'd been cheated, calculating exactly how much had been taken beyond fair payment, documenting a systematic pattern of exploitation that had built the Whitmore family fortune. Charles had spent his retirement researching the families affected, trying to understand the full scope of what his ancestors had done and what impact it had on people whose lives had been shaped by theft they'd been powerless to prevent or prove. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I am sealing this money because I cannot return it to the families wronged. Many have scattered, some have died, others would face tax complications or family disputes if sudden wealth appeared generations after the theft occurred, Charles had written near the journal's end. But I also cannot keep it, cannot live out my remaining days as if this fortune was honestly earned. I am leaving it here with documentation of exactly how it was acquired, with the hope that whoever finds this chamber will have more courage than I did, will find a way to acknowledge the debt and direct this wealth toward purposes that serve justice rather than perpetuating theft. Daniel sat on the chamber's stone floor, his mind racing through implications he was still trying to process. The boxes contained what he estimated was several $100,000, maybe more, along with documentation that proved the money had been systematically stolen from farmers over decades. Charles Whitmore had died in 1982, had sealed this chamber knowing the mill would eventually be sold or torn down, trusting that someone would find what he'd hidden and would face the choice he'd avoided, speak truth or maintain silence. This money could solve all our problems, Emma said quietly, her voice showing understanding beyond her 10 years. We could pay rent, fix the truck, buy groceries without checking prices. Yeah, Daniel said, hearing the complexity in his own voice. But it's not really ours. It was stolen from farmers who trusted the mill to process grain fairly, who had no way to verify they were being cheated. Charles Whitmore spent his last years documenting that theft, leaving evidence that whoever found this was supposed to do something about it. But the farmers are probably dead by now. It's been over 40 years. Their families aren't dead. Their descendants are living with whatever impact that theft had, farms lost because profit margins were too thin, opportunities missed because capital that should have been theirs was stolen, generational poverty that might have been prevented if the mill had operated honestly. Daniel looked at the boxes of money, at the journal that documented systematic exploitation, at the burden Charles Whitmore had passed forward to whoever was desperate enough to buy an abandoned mill for salvage. They carried the boxes out of the chamber carefully, loading them into Daniel's truck with a tarp covering them from casual observation. The mill suddenly felt different, no longer just a building to be dismantled for scrap but a testament to something darker, a monument to the kind of systematic theft that had been possible when people with power controlled the systems everyone else depended on. That evening, after Emma was asleep in their cramped apartment, Daniel sat at the kitchen table reading through Charles Whitmore's journal and the supporting documentation. The ledgers showed exactly what had been taken from each farmer, how the percentages had been manipulated, how the theft had been concealed through complexity and the assumption that poor farmers wouldn't challenge a prosperous mill owner's accounting. Charles had calculated that over 40 years of operation under his grandfather and father, the mill had extracted approximately $400,000 beyond fair payment, wealth that should have stayed in the farming community but had instead built the Whitmore family's prosperity. The documentation was meticulous, showed a man who'd spent years trying to understand the full scope of what his family had done. Charles had tracked down descendants when possible, had documented which families still lived in the area and which had scattered. He'd created a kind of roadmap for restitution, a guide for whoever found the chamber and decided to honor the debt his family had created. Daniel's phone rang around midnight, the county clerk's office calling with news that was both expected and devastating. The mill's property taxes were more delinquent than the auction listing had indicated, and the environmental assessment required for the property transfer had revealed significant issues with the mill's old grain storage areas. Unless Daniel paid for remediation and cleared the tax debt, the county would seize the property and he'd lose both his investment and any salvage rights. The total cost, $8,000, due within 30 days. Daniel looked at the boxes of money stacked in his closet, at wealth that could solve his immediate problems but that came with moral weight he wasn't sure he could carry. He spent the rest of the night researching the families Charles Whitmore had documented, finding that some still lived in the county, still farmed land their grandparents had worked, still lived with the economic marginality that decades of systematic theft had helped create. The next morning, Daniel took Emma to school and then drove to the County Historical Society, asking to speak with someone who knew local farming history. He was directed to Margaret Brennan, a retired teacher who'd been documenting agricultural families for 40 years, collecting oral histories and researching how economic changes had shaped the community. The Whitmore Mill was essential infrastructure for generations, Margaret explained after Daniel asked general questions about grain processing. Farmers had no choice but to use it. Transporting grain to other processors wasn't economical, and the Whitmores knew that. There were always rumors that the mill's measurements weren't entirely honest, that farmers got back less flour than they should have, but proving it was impossible. The Whitmores controlled the scales and the records. What happened to farmers who suspected they were being cheated? Margaret's expression showed she'd heard this question before. Most just accepted it as the cost of doing business. A few tried to challenge the mill's accounting, but the Whitmores had lawyers and standing in the community. Farmers, especially black farmers or those who were barely literate, didn't have resources to fight. So the theft continued, concealed behind complexity and the assumption that important families wouldn't cheat their neighbors. Daniel made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. What if someone had documentation proving the mill was systematically stealing from farmers? Ledgers showing exactly who was cheated and how much was taken, written by Charles Whitmore himself as a confession? Margaret went very still, her historian's instincts recognizing something significant. Does such documentation exist? Daniel explained what he'd found in the chamber, showing her photocopies of Charles Whitmore's journal entries and supporting ledgers. Margaret read with growing intensity, her face showing recognition of names, of families, of the systematic pattern Charles had documented. This is evidence of systematic fraud that affected dozens of families over 40 years, she said finally. Charles Whitmore documented what his family did, but he didn't have the courage to make it public or attempt restitution while alive. He left money too. Several $100,000 sealed with the documentation, with instructions that whoever found it should direct the wealth toward purposes that serve justice. Daniel paused. I need that money. I bought the mill for salvage income one now can't pursue because of tax and environmental issues. But using stolen money to solve my problems means becoming complicit in the theft Charles documented. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying Daniel's face. You could just take the money and say nothing. Charles is dead, most of the farmers who were cheated are dead, the documentation has been sealed for 40 years. Nobody would know except you. But I would know. And Emma would know, because she was there when we found the chamber. What would that teach her about integrity? That you take what you need regardless of where it came from or who it was stolen from. Over the next week, Margaret helped Daniel research the families Charles Whitmore had documented. Some had prospered despite the mill's theft, had found success through determination in circumstances that overcame the disadvantage of systematic cheating. Others had struggled, had lost farms to foreclosure during hard years when profit margins were too thin, had scattered north or west seeking opportunities that no longer existed in a county whose economy had contracted. The pattern became clear: the theft hadn't affected everyone equally. Families with resources, with education, with connections, they'd absorbed the loss and moved forward. But families that were already marginal, that were poor or black or dependent on every dollar for survival, for them, the systematic theft had been catastrophic, had pushed them over edges they might have avoided if the mill had operated honestly. Daniel also learned that the Whitmore family still existed locally. Charles's nephew Robert ran the county's agricultural equipment dealership, his daughter Jennifer served on the school board, both living respectable lives built on the foundation their family had created. They knew nothing about what Charles had documented, had grown up believing the Whitmore mill's success was earned through honest work and good business practices. The confrontation Daniel was avoiding became inevitable when Jennifer Whitmore appeared at his apartment 3 weeks after he'd found the chamber. She was maybe 50, with the careful presentation of someone used to public roles, her expression showing confusion about why she'd been told to speak with him about family history. "The Historical Society said you have documents related to the mill," Jennifer said after Daniel invited her in. "Documents written by my Uncle Charles?" Daniel showed her the journal and ledgers, watching her face change as she read, as understanding of what her family had done replaced the comfortable narrative she'd believed her whole life. She read in silence for 20 minutes, her hands trembling slightly, her breathing becoming more deliberate as the full scope of the theft became clear. "My God," she said finally. "He documented everything. Every family cheated, every dollar stolen, the systematic pattern of taking more from people who couldn't fight back." She looked at Daniel. "You found this sealed in the mill's foundation?" Along with several $100,000 Charles left with instructions that whoever found it should direct the money towards serving justice. Daniel paused. "I need that money. I bought the mill for salvage, discovered I can't afford the tax and environmental costs, and I'm facing eviction if I can't find income soon." But Charles's documentation makes it clear the money was stolen systematically from farmers who trusted the mill to operate honestly. Jennifer set down the journal, her face showing a woman processing information that shattered her understanding of her own history. "Robert and I built our lives on the foundation our family created. The dealership, my father's investments that paid for my education, the respect our family name carries, all of it was built on this theft." Charles couldn't speak the truth while alive, but he made sure eventually someone would know. "I found it because I was desperate for salvage income. Now I have to decide whether to use stolen money to solve my problems or whether to honor what Charles was trying to accomplish by sealing this chamber." Over the next month, a complicated negotiation emerged. Jennifer and Robert Whitmore acknowledged what their family had done, recognized they'd benefited from systematic theft even if they hadn't committed it personally. They agreed to work with Margaret Brennan and local farming families to create something that served justice rather than perpetuating the Whitmore's comfortable position. The solution they developed was multifaceted. The money Charles had sealed would be used to establish a fund supporting struggling farmers, particularly those from families that had been most affected by the mill's theft. The Whitmores would contribute additional funds from their own resources, acknowledging that their wealth had been built partially on stolen proceeds. And the mill itself would be preserved as a working museum, teaching the history of grain processing while also telling the truth about how the Whitmore mill had operated. Daniel's immediate crisis was resolved through a different mechanism. Robert Whitmore hired him to do restoration carpentry on the mill's preservation, paying wages that covered the tax debt and environmental remediation while allowing Daniel to work on a project that had meaning beyond simple survival. The work would take years, would require research and careful craftsmanship and commitment to historical accuracy, but it provided stable income and purpose that went beyond dismantling buildings for scrap. "You could have just taken the money," Robert said during their first meeting about the restoration project. "Could have used it to solve your problems and left us to our comfortable ignorance about what our family did. Why didn't you?" Daniel thought about this, about the choice he'd faced and the reasons that had made one path impossible despite its convenience. "Because Emma was there when we found the chamber. She would have known I chose my comfort over doing right, would have learned that integrity was something you practiced only when it didn't cost you anything. I couldn't teach her that lesson, couldn't let her grow up believing that's how you operate when circumstances test your character." The mill's transformation took 3 years, during which Daniel and Emma's lives stabilized in ways that felt almost miraculous compared to where they'd been. The restoration work paid well, provided health insurance, created the kind of financial security that allowed planning beyond the next rent payment. Emma flourished with the stability, her grades improving, her confidence growing, her understanding of justice and legacy deepening through proximity to the project her father was helping build. The mill reopened as a working museum on a warm day in May, its machinery restored to operation, its interpretive displays telling both the practical story of grain processing and the difficult truth about how the Whitmore mill had systematically cheated farmers for 40 years. Charles Whitmore's journal was displayed behind glass, his confession and documentation available for anyone who wanted to understand the full complexity of what had happened. The Whitmore family built prosperity through 4 generations of operating this mill, the main display read. But that prosperity was built partially on systematic theft from farmers who had no alternative processors and no means to challenge manipulated measurements. Charles Whitmore documented this theft in his final years but lacked the courage to speak truth while alive. His sealed chamber and the money it contained were found by someone facing desperate circumstances who chose to honor truth rather than personal survival. Daniel attended the opening with Emma and Rachel, a woman he'd met during the restoration project who worked for the State Agricultural Commission and who'd been involved in establishing the support fund for farming families. She understood his commitment to the project, respected the choice he'd made to honor Charles Whitmore's intended purpose rather than simply taking what he needed, brought her own strength and wisdom to a relationship that had developed slowly over years of working together. The ceremony drew farming families from across the county, some whose grandparents had been cheated by the mill, others who'd heard stories about the Whitmore's practices but had lacked proof. Jennifer and Robert Whitmore stood before them, acknowledging what their family had done and what they were trying to build as partial restitution. "We cannot undo 40 years of systematic theft," Jennifer said, her voice carrying across the crowd. "We cannot return stolen profit to people who are long dead, cannot compensate families adequately for opportunities lost because capital that should have been theirs was taken. But we can stop perpetuating lies about our family's success, can acknowledge that our prosperity was built partially on theft, can create something that serves truth and supports the farming community our family exploited." Christine Holloway, whose grandfather's farm had been lost partially because the mill's systematic cheating had narrowed already thin profit margins, spoke about what acknowledgement meant to families who'd carried the weight of unexplained failure. "My grandfather blamed himself for losing the farm, died believing he hadn't worked hard enough or managed resources well enough to survive. Learning that the mill was stealing from him systematically, that his failure wasn't entirely his fault, that changes the story my family tells about itself. That matters." The support fund began distributing grants to struggling farmers, particularly those from families that had been most affected by the mill's theft. The amounts weren't huge, a few $1,000s per family, but they represented acknowledgement that debts were owed, that systematic theft had occurred, that the Whitmore family recognized their obligation to address what their ancestors had done. Daniel's work on the mill continued beyond the initial restoration, expanding to include maintenance and programming, developing educational materials that helped visitors understand both the practical mechanics of grain processing and the ethical complexity of how power and information asymmetry could enable systematic exploitation. Emma worked at the mill part-time through high school, giving tours and explaining the displays, her understanding of justice and legacy shaped by proximity to this history. The years passed with the steady rhythm of meaningful work, each season adding depth to the mill's role as both working museum and testament to difficult truths. The fund supporting struggling farmers grew beyond the initial money Charles Whitmore had sealed, supported by donations and grants and the Whitmore family's ongoing contributions. It helped dozens of farming families weather bad years, provided capital for equipment and improvements, created opportunities that might not have existed without this acknowledgement of historical debt. On a cool evening in October, 10 years after Daniel had found the chamber, Emma, now 20 and studying agricultural economics in college, gave a presentation at the mill about intergenerational wealth and how systematic exploitation created disadvantages that persisted across generations. She used the Whitmore Mill as a case study, showing how 40 years of theft from farming families had affected not just the farmers themselves but their children and grandchildren, how capital that should have been invested in land and equipment and education was instead stolen through manipulated measurements. The mill took approximately $10,000 from my great-great-grandfather over 20 years of processing grain, Christine Holloway's granddaughter said during the question period after Emma's presentation. That doesn't sound like much until you calculate what that money could have done if it had stayed in my family, land purchased, equipment bought, education funded. The compound effect over 4 generations is substantial. We're talking about wealth that was stolen and how that theft shaped everything that followed. Daniel watched his daughter field questions with confidence and clarity, saw how the experience of being 10 years old when they'd found the chamber had shaped her entire understanding of justice and obligation. She'd learned that some discoveries came with responsibilities that transcended personal benefit, that truth required courage to speak especially when silence would be more comfortable, that legacy was built through choices made when circumstances tested character. Robert Whitmore had passed away 3 years earlier, but his children continued supporting the mill and the fund, had absorbed the lesson that inherited wealth came with inherited obligation to address how that wealth had been acquired. Jennifer Whitmore still served on the mill's board, still spoke honestly about her family's history when asked, still worked to ensure the truth remained visible rather than buried behind comfortable mythology. The mill itself had become an unexpected success, drawing visitors from across the region who wanted to understand both the practical history of grain processing and the ethical complexity of how systematic exploitation had operated in rural communities. School groups visited regularly, students learning that history wasn't just dates and events but also patterns of power and resistance, theft and acknowledgement, silence and eventually truth-telling. Daniel's life had stabilized in ways that felt almost miraculous compared to where he'd been that desperate November when he'd bought the mill for salvage. The restoration work had led to other projects, consulting on historic preservation throughout the region, building expertise that was valued and compensated fairly. He and Rachel had married 5 years into the mill project, had created a family that honored Emma's loss while building something new that served them all. On a warm afternoon in late spring, 15 years after finding the chamber, Daniel stood in the mill watching grinding stones turn as they had for generations, processing grain brought by local farmers who trusted that measurements would be honest and fair. The mill operated again not as commercial enterprise but as working demonstration, as testament to the craft and community infrastructure that small-scale processing had represented. Emma appeared beside him, home from college for the weekend, her presence a reminder of how far they'd come from that desperate time when $465 had seemed like salvation if only he could convert an abandoned mill into salvageable materials. "Do you ever regret not just taking the money?" Emma asked, her voice showing she already knew the answer but wanted to hear it spoken. "Sometimes I think about how much easier things would have been if I'd just used it to solve our immediate problems," Daniel admitted. "But then I think about what that would have taught you, what kind of man I would have become if I'd chosen my comfort over doing right." The answer is no. Finding that chamber, making the choice to honor what Charles Whitmore intended, that gave me more than money could have provided. "It gave you purpose," Emma said. "And it taught me that integrity means something even when it costs you everything you think you need." They stood together in the mill that had been salvation and burden, that had provided not the easy solution Daniel had sought but something far more valuable, the opportunity to build something meaningful from discovery, to honor truth rather than perpetuate theft, to demonstrate for his daughter that character was defined by choices made when circumstances tested your principles. The land around the mill stretched away in patterns that predated the building, predated the Whitmore family's operation, predated human claims entirely. It had provided grain for processing across generations, had witnessed both honest work and systematic theft, had held Charles Whitmore's sealed chamber until circumstances brought the right person to find it. The creek that powered the mill's water wheel still flowed, still turned mechanisms that converted motion into the work of grinding grain, still demonstrated the simple physics that rural communities had depended on before electricity made such infrastructure obsolete. Margaret Brennan visited occasionally, documenting the mill's transformation for the Historical Society, recording oral histories from farming families about their experiences with the Whitmore mill and their reactions to learning truth that had been hidden for decades. She'd become the mill's unofficial historian, ensuring that both the practical story and the ethical complexity were preserved for future generations. "You changed a lot of lives by not taking that money," Margaret said during one of her visits, watching Daniel demonstrate the grinding process for a school group. "The support fund has helped dozens of farming families. The mill tells truth that needed telling, and you showed Emma what integrity looks like when it's tested by real circumstances. I stumbled into doing the right thing because I was desperate for salvage income and happened to buy a mill nobody else wanted. The rest just followed from trying to honor what Charles Whitmore had intended when he sealed that chamber. You could have ignored his intentions. Could have taken the money and justified it by saying he was dead and the farmers were dead and nobody would be harmed by your silence. But you didn't, and that choice created possibilities nobody expected." The years continued their steady progression, each one adding layers to the mill's story and to the community's understanding of how systematic exploitation had operated and eventually been acknowledged. The support fund grew beyond the initial money Charles had sealed, became sustainable through ongoing contributions and grant funding, helped hundreds of farming families weather difficulties that might otherwise have forced them off land their families had worked for generations. Jennifer Whitmore's grandchildren grew up knowing the full truth about their family history, learning that the Whitmore name was associated with both agricultural infrastructure and systematic theft, that their inherited wealth came with inherited obligation to address how that wealth had been acquired. They volunteered at the mill, helped with programming, demonstrated for the younger generation that facing difficult truths was possible and necessary. On a golden afternoon in September, 20 years after Daniel had found the chamber, the mill hosted a ceremony honoring Charles Whitmore's courage in documenting truth even though he'd lacked the courage to speak it while alive. The event acknowledged complexity, that Charles had benefited from his family's theft even while documenting it, that he'd sealed away evidence rather than making it public, that his solution had been incomplete but had created possibilities for others to do what he couldn't. Charles Whitmore lived with knowledge that poisoned him, Daniel said during the ceremony, speaking about a man he'd never met but whose sealed chamber had changed everything. He knew what his family had done, knew the mill's prosperity was built partially on systematic theft, knew that farmers had been cheated and had no means to challenge the exploitation. He documented all of it with meticulous care, but he couldn't speak the truth while alive. So he sealed it in a chamber with money and instructions that whoever found it should serve justice rather than personal benefit. Emma stood beside her father, now 25 and working for the State Agricultural Commission on programs supporting sustainable farming and historical preservation. She'd built a career around the lessons learned from that November day when she'd been 10 years old and had noticed something wrong in the mill's foundation, when her father had faced a choice between personal survival and honoring truth. "The chamber gave my father more than money," Emma said when it was her turn to speak. "It gave him the opportunity to demonstrate integrity when integrity was expensive, to honor truth when silence would have been easier, to show me that some things matter more than personal comfort. That lesson shaped everything I've become." Christine Holloway's family attended, 3 generations who'd been affected by the mill's theft and by the eventual acknowledgement that their grandfather's failure hadn't been entirely his fault. The support fund had helped them weather difficult years, had provided capital for improvements that made their farm more sustainable, had created opportunities that might not have existed without this acknowledgement of historical debt. "The mill took from my grandfather, but Daniel Foster and the Whitmore descendants gave back something more valuable than money," Christine's granddaughter said. "They gave back truth, gave back the understanding that our family's struggles weren't entirely our fault, gave back dignity that had been stolen along with the profit margins. That matters across generations." As evening settled over the mill and the ceremony concluded, As people lingered to tour the building and read displays that told both practical and ethical stories, Daniel walked to the foundation where the chamber had been sealed. The entrance was preserved now, marked with interpretive signage that explained what Charles Whitmore had hidden and why, what Daniel had found and what choices had followed. Rachel found him there, understanding without words why he'd needed this moment alone with the memory of what had started everything. They stood together looking at the chamber entrance that had been concealed for 40 years, at the space that had held not just money but testimony, not just wealth but evidence demanding acknowledgement. "You built something good from that discovery," Rachel said quietly. "Charles Whitmore built it by documenting truth and trusting it would eventually matter. I just happened to be the person desperate enough to buy a mill nobody wanted, thorough enough to find what he'd hidden, and stubborn enough to honor what he intended rather than just taking what I needed. That's still choice. A lot of people would have chosen differently." Daniel thought about this, about the years of consequence that had flowed from one moment of deciding to honor Charles Whitmore's documented intentions rather than simply using stolen money to solve immediate problems. "I got lucky that doing right eventually worked out. But even if it hadn't, even if I'd lost the apartment and ended up homeless, I'd still know I chose right. That would have mattered even if nothing else good came from it." They walked out together as twilight painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, the mill's windows glowing with warm light, its structure solid and purposeful, its story preserved in stone and wood and carefully maintained machinery. The building that had been meant for salvage had become testament to something more valuable. That buried truth eventually surfaced when the right person looked in the right place, that integrity meant something even when it was expensive, that some discoveries came with obligations that transcended personal benefit. The land stretched away in patterns that predated human claims, the creek still flowing in its ancient channel, the soil still rich with potential for growing grain that could be processed into flour that fed communities. The mill had been part of that cycle for over a century, had served both honestly and dishonestly, had eventually become a place where truth was told alongside the practical story of how water power and stone wheels converted grain into usable flour. Above, stars appeared in patterns that had looked down on this land before the mill was built, before the Whitmore family had operated it, before Charles had sealed his chamber, before Daniel had lifted a stone facing and found what had been waiting 40 years for someone to discover. Those stars would continue after everyone currently alive was gone, witnessing the slow work of communities learning to face difficult truths and honor the people harmed by systematic exploitation. The mill stood in the gathering darkness, its purpose transformed but its bones solid, its story complete in the way that matters, not with neat resolution but with acknowledgement that some wounds take generations to heal, that some debts can never be fully repaid but can be acknowledged and partially addressed. That truth eventually emerges when people have courage to speak it or document it or honor it when they stumble across evidence that demands response. Daniel had bought that mill for $465, seeking salvage income that would keep him and Emma housed through another desperate winter. He'd found instead a sealed chamber containing not just money but moral burden, not just wealth but testimony demanding that whoever found it choose between personal benefit and serving justice. He'd chosen justice, had honored Charles Whitmore's documented intentions, had demonstrated for his daughter that integrity meant something even when the cost was everything you thought you needed. The mill would stand as long as its oak beams and stone foundation held, would tell its story to whoever came seeking to understand how systematic exploitation had operated in rural communities and how eventually, through documentation and discovery and choice, truth had emerged and been honored. It would acknowledge Charles Whitmore's complicated legacy, would recognize the farming families who'd been exploited, would celebrate the choice Daniel had made to honor truth rather than take what he needed regardless of its source. That was enough. More than enough. It was justice arriving late but arriving nonetheless, carried forward by a desperate man who'd needed salvage income and found instead sealed testimony, who'd chosen revelation over convenience and in doing so had helped heal wounds that had festered across generations. The chamber had been waiting, patient as only buried things can be, holding its secrets until circumstances brought someone worthy to find it. And Daniel had proven worthy not by being perfect but by choosing right when choosing right was expensive, by honoring what Charles Whitmore had intended rather than simply taking what would have solved his immediate problems, by demonstrating that some inheritances came with obligations that transcended personal benefit. The land remembered everything, held every truth beneath its surface, gave up its secrets when the time was right and the person was willing to honor what was found rather than simply exploit it. The mill stood as proof that buried things eventually surfaced, that silence eventually broke, that truth mattered even when speaking it or honoring it cost everything you thought you needed. The following spring marked the mill's 20th anniversary as a working museum, and the celebration drew farming families from 3 states, historians and agricultural experts, students who'd written dissertations on rural economic exploitation, journalists documenting communities that chose truth over comfortable mythology. Daniel stood at the edge of the crowd watching Emma coordinate the day's events with the practiced efficiency she'd developed over years of working in agricultural policy, seeing in her the 10-year-old girl who'd noticed a gap in foundation stones and changed everything. The support fund Charles Whitmore had inadvertently created through his sealed chamber had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started as several $100,000 of documented stolen wealth had become a $2 million endowment supporting sustainable farming throughout the region. The fund provided grants for equipment and infrastructure, scholarships for farmers' children pursuing agricultural education, emergency assistance for families facing the kind of financial crisis that had once driven farmers off land their families had worked for generations. Margaret Brennan, now in her 80s but still sharp as ever, had compiled oral histories from 40 farming families affected by the Whitmore Mill's systematic theft. Their stories filled an archive at the State Agricultural Library, documented how small-scale exploitation could compound across generations, showed how families made different choices based on resources stolen or preserved. Some had prospered despite the theft, had overcome the disadvantage through determination and favorable circumstances. Others had struggled, had lost land or opportunities or the stability that capital provides, had scattered seeking work that no longer existed in counties whose agricultural economies had contracted. The theft wasn't always immediately catastrophic, Margaret explained during an interview for a documentary being filmed about the mill. But it narrowed margins that were already thin, took away buffer that might have helped families survive bad years or invest in improvements. My research shows that families systematically cheated by the mill were 3 times more likely to lose their farms during the 1980s agricultural crisis than families the mill treated honestly. That's the compound effect of exploitation. It creates vulnerabilities that manifest years or decades later. Christine Holloway had become the mill's most visible advocate, traveling to speak at universities and agricultural conferences about intergenerational theft and restitution. Her grandfather's farm, lost in 1984 partially because profit margins eroded by the mill's cheating had left no buffer for bad years, had been repurchased by her family using support fund grants and loans. She and her children now worked land her grandfather had been forced to sell, had restored the farm to sustainable operation, had created a model for how historical debt could be partially addressed through targeted support and acknowledgement. The money from the support fund didn't erase what happened to my grandfather, Christine said during her presentation at the anniversary celebration. Nothing can give back the years he spent believing he'd failed, the shame he carried thinking he hadn't worked hard enough or managed resources well enough. But the fund helped us reclaim land our family should never have lost, helped us build something sustainable that honors his work and acknowledges that his failure wasn't entirely his fault. That matters. The Whitmore family's ongoing commitment to restitution had evolved over 2 decades. Jennifer Whitmore had established a scholarship program specifically for descendants of families her family's mill had exploited, funding agricultural education for students who might not otherwise have access. Robert Whitmore's children had endowed a chair at the State Agricultural College studying sustainable farming practices and economic justice in rural communities. The family couldn't undo 4 generations of systematic theft, but they could acknowledge the debt and work to address its ongoing impact. Daniel had watched this evolution with something approaching awe, had seen how his choice to honor Charles Whitmore's intentions rather than simply take needed money had created ripples that extended far beyond what he'd imagined possible. The mill had become more than a museum, had transformed into a center for agricultural advocacy and education, had created community in ways that transcended its original purpose of grinding grain into flour. Emma had found her calling in this work, had built a career helping farming communities navigate challenges of sustainability and economic pressure and the reality that small-scale agriculture operated at disadvantages in markets designed for industrial production. She'd brought sophisticated analysis to understanding how historical exploitation created present vulnerabilities, how targeted support could address generational disadvantage, how communities could face difficult truths without being paralyzed by them. My father found a chamber sealed by a man who documented theft but couldn't speak truth while alive, Emma said during a panel discussion at the anniversary celebration. That discovery created a choice: take needed money regardless of its source, or honor what Charles Whitmore had intended. My father chose integrity over survival, and that choice taught me that some things matter more than personal comfort. That lesson has shaped everything I've done since. The mill itself had been maintained with meticulous care over 20 years, its machinery kept operational through regular attention and the kind of skilled preservation work Daniel had spent 2 decades perfecting. The building breathed with the confidence of structures that have found renewed purpose, that serve communities in ways that justify the effort required to keep them standing. Visitors came steadily, school groups and tourists, farming families and historians, people seeking to understand how systematic exploitation had operated and how communities had eventually chosen acknowledgement over silence. The interpretive displays had been updated regularly as new research emerged, as more families came forward with stories about the mill's practices, as historians documented the broader context of rural economic exploitation during the Depression and post-war years. The displays didn't flinch from complexity, showed that Charles Whitmore had benefited from theft even while documenting it, acknowledged that his solution had been incomplete but had created possibilities for others to finish what he'd started. Daniel's relationship with Rachel had deepened over the years into something that felt as solid as the mill's stone foundation. They'd married 7 years after he'd found the chamber, had created a home that honored Emma's loss while building something new that served them all. Rachel had brought her own children from a previous marriage, 2 boys who'd grown up helping at the mill, learning about grain processing and historical preservation and the importance of facing difficult truths. The family they'd built wasn't conventional, was pieced together from losses and second chances and the determination to create something meaningful from whatever circumstances provided. But it worked, held together by shared values about integrity and community and the principle that some inheritances came with obligations that transcended personal benefit. On a quiet evening after the anniversary celebration had ended, after visitors had departed and volunteers had finished cleaning up, Daniel walked through the mill alone, his footsteps echoing in spaces he'd come to know intimately over 20 years. He stopped at the chamber entrance, now preserved behind protective glass but still visible, still marking the place where everything had changed. He thought about that November day when he'd bought the mill for salvage, when $465 had seemed like salvation if only he could convert abandoned infrastructure into materials he could sell. He thought about Emma finding the gap in the foundation, about the stone facing coming away to reveal Charles Whitmore's sealed door, about the boxes of money and the journal documenting systematic theft that demanded response. The choice he'd faced then still felt vivid despite 2 decades of distance: take what he needed regardless of its source, or honor truth that was expensive and complicated and would solve nothing immediately. He'd chosen truth, had made that choice in part because Emma was watching, because teaching his daughter that integrity was conditional on convenience was a lesson he couldn't bear to give. That choice had cost him the salvage income he desperately needed, had made his immediate crisis worse before it got better, had required faith that doing right would eventually matter even if it didn't solve immediate problems. But it had also given him something he couldn't have anticipated: purpose that went beyond survival, work that mattered beyond paying bills, the knowledge that when circumstances tested his character he'd chosen the harder path because it was the right one. Rachel found him there, understanding without words why he'd needed this moment alone with memory. She slipped her hand into his, both of them quiet with their own thoughts about the journey that had brought them here, about the mill that had been meant for salvage and had become legacy, about the choice that had changed everything. 20 years, Rachel said finally. The mill, the fund, the community that's built around acknowledging difficult truth, all of it started because you found a chamber and chose to honor what it contained rather than just take what you needed. Charles Whitmore built it by documenting truth and trusting it would eventually matter, Daniel corrected. I just happened to be desperate enough to buy a mill nobody wanted, thorough enough to find what he'd hidden, and too stubborn or too scared to teach Emma the wrong lesson about integrity. You were brave, Rachel said. Not the kind of brave that looks dramatic, but the kind that matters. Choosing right when wrong would have been easier and more profitable. They stood together in the mill that had been crime scene and construction project and eventually testament to the principle that truth mattered even when speaking it was expensive. Outside, the land stretched away in patterns that predated human claims, the creek still flowing in its ancient channel, the field still productive when worked with care and attention. The anniversary celebration had drawn attention from unexpected places. A foundation studying economic justice had contacted Emma about replicating the support fund model in other communities, about creating pathways for acknowledging historical exploitation and directing resources toward addressing its ongoing impact. Universities were teaching the mill story in courses about rural sociology and agricultural economics and the ethics of restitution. Journalists had written features about communities choosing truth over comfortable mythology. The mill had become a case study in how difficult histories could be acknowledged without paralyzing communities, how restitution could be pursued even when direct compensation was impossible, how moral courage could create possibilities that didn't exist when silence was maintained. Daniel hadn't intended any of this when he'd called the Historical Society asking questions about the Whitmore family. He'd just been trying to understand what obligation came with finding stolen money sealed beside documentation of systematic theft. But intentions mattered less than choices, and the choices Daniel had made, to research rather than simply take, to contact families rather than keep silent, to honor Charles Whitmore's purpose rather than convenient myself, those choices had created ripples that extended far beyond what he'd imagined possible. The mill stood as proof that one person choosing right could create possibilities for communities to heal wounds that had festered across generations. Emma brought her children to visit occasionally, 3 grandchildren who'd grown up hearing stories about the mill and the chamber and the choice their grandfather had made when circumstances tested his character. They loved the mill, loved the grinding demonstrations and the interpretive displays and the sense that this place meant something important even if they couldn't fully articulate what. The oldest, Maya, had started volunteering as a tour guide at 14, had absorbed her grandmother Emma's passion for agricultural justice and historical truth-telling. Great-grandpa Daniel could have just taken the money, Maya explained during tours, her voice carrying the confidence of teenagers who found purpose. Could have used it to pay rent and buy groceries and fix the truck. But he knew the money was stolen from farmers who'd been cheated by the mill, knew that using it meant becoming complicit in that theft. So he chose to honor what Charles Whitmore had intended, that whoever found the chamber should serve justice rather than personal benefit. That choice created everything you see here. Daniel listened to his great-granddaughter tell his story with the kind of clarity he'd never managed, heard in her voice the understanding that character was defined by choices made when circumstances made right and easy diverge. She'd learned the lesson he'd been trying to teach Emma that November day when they'd found the chamber, that integrity meant something even when it was expensive, that some things mattered more than personal survival, that the measure of a person was what they chose when choosing right cost everything they thought they needed. The mill's influence had extended into unexpected areas. The state agricultural department had adopted policies supporting struggling farmers that were modeled on the fund Charles Whitmore had inadvertently created. Universities had established research programs studying intergenerational effects of economic exploitation. Communities across the region had begun examining their own histories, looking for sealed chambers literal or metaphorical, finding uncomfortable truths about how prosperity had been built and who had paid the costs. Margaret Brennan's oral history project had evolved into a permanent archive documenting not just the Whitmore Mills theft but the broader patterns of rural economic exploitation that had been possible when people with power controlled the systems everyone else depended on. Her work had influenced state curricula, had changed how agricultural history was taught, had ensured that the stories of people like Christine Holloway's grandfather were preserved alongside the stories of prosperous farmers and successful operations. History is complicated, Margaret said during an interview for her retirement celebration at 91. The Whitmore Mill was both essential infrastructure that served the community and the site of systematic theft that harmed vulnerable families. Charles Whitmore both benefited from that theft and documented it for future generations to address. Daniel Foster both needed the money desperately and chose to honor truth rather than take it. All of these things are true simultaneously, and understanding that complexity is essential to understanding how communities function and fail and sometimes find ways to heal. The mill had weathered 20 years of operation as a museum, had required constant attention and maintenance and the kind of skilled preservation work Daniel had spent 2 decades perfecting. But the building remained solid, its oak beams still structural, its stone foundations still supporting the weight of machinery and history and the community that had formed around acknowledging difficult truths. The water wheel still turned when the creek flowed high enough, still demonstrated the simple physics that had powered rural industry before electricity made such infrastructure obsolete. On a warm afternoon in late June, 25 years after Daniel had found the chamber, Emma returned to the mill with news that completed a circle nobody had anticipated. The State Agricultural Commission, where she'd worked for 15 years, was purchasing farmland adjacent to the mill to create a demonstration farm showing sustainable practices and historical agricultural methods. The land had once been part of the Whitmore family holdings, had been sold off during the subdivision of the property, was returning to agricultural use after decades of lying fallow. We'll grow heritage grains using historical methods, then mill them here using the water wheel and stone grinding, Emma explained during a planning meeting with the mill's board. It creates a complete educational loop. People can see how grain was grown and harvested and processed, can understand the full cycle of what it meant to be a farming community before industrialization changed everything. And we'll use the harvest to support the food bank, creating direct connection between historical demonstration and present community need. Daniel listened to his daughter lay out this vision, seeing in it the kind of thinking that transformed historical preservation from backward-looking nostalgia into something that served present purposes while honoring past practices. The demonstration farm would employ local people, would teach skills that were disappearing, would create food that fed communities while educating them about where that food came from and how it had been produced across generations. The project moved forward over the next 3 years, transforming adjacent land into productive demonstration of how farming had operated before chemical fertilizers and industrial equipment and global markets had changed the scale and methods of agricultural production. Heritage wheat and corn grew in fields that had last been cultivated 50 years earlier, tended using methods that Charles Whitmore's grandfather would have recognized, harvested with period-appropriate equipment maintained by volunteers who'd learned historical agricultural practices. The grain was brought to the mill for processing just as it had been for over a century, ground using water power and stone wheels, producing flour that was distributed through the food bank and used in educational programs teaching people about food systems and agricultural history and the reality that eating had always been connected to land and labor and the skilled work of processing raw materials into usable products. The complete cycle, growing, harvesting, processing, distributing, created community in ways the museum alone couldn't achieve. People who grew the grain and people who processed it and people who received the flour all became part of a system that demonstrated how rural economies had functioned before specialization and industrialization had separated production from consumption, had made food seem like something that appeared on grocery store shelves rather than something that required land and water and skilled labor to create. Daniel worked on the demonstration farm occasionally, his carpentry skills adapting to building period-appropriate equipment and structures, his understanding of historical preservation extending to agricultural practices and the tools and buildings that had made farming possible before modern technology. He was 65 now, his body showing the wear of decades of physical work, but he remained strong enough to contribute meaningfully and found satisfaction in creating something educational and productive. Rachel had retired from the Agricultural Commission but remained active in policy work, consulting on programs supporting sustainable farming and rural economic development. She and Daniel had built a life that felt complete despite its origins in loss and desperation, had created stability through work that mattered and relationships that honored everyone's histories while building something new. The mill celebrated its 30th anniversary as a working museum with less fanfare than the 20th but with deeper impact. The institution had become essential infrastructure, not for grinding grain commercially but for educating communities, supporting farming families, preserving knowledge that would otherwise be lost, creating space for acknowledging difficult truths without being destroyed by them. Emma spoke at the ceremony, now 50 years old and recently appointed director of the state's entire agricultural preservation program. 3 decades ago, my father bought an abandoned mill for salvage, needed desperately to convert it into money that would keep us housed. Instead, he found a sealed chamber containing both stolen wealth and documentation of systematic theft that demanded moral response. His choice to honor truth rather than take what he needed created everything you see here: the museum, the support fund, the demonstration farm, the community that's formed around acknowledging that prosperity was sometimes built on exploitation and that addressing that history matters. Christine Holloway's granddaughter spoke about farming land her great-great-grandfather had worked, had lost, and that her family had eventually reclaimed through support fund assistance. The mill took from my family for 40 years, but Daniel Foster and the Whitmore descendants gave back something more valuable than the money stolen. They gave back truth, gave back understanding that our family's struggles weren't entirely our fault, gave back dignity and the opportunity to rebuild on land that should never have been lost. 3 generations of my family have benefited from choices Daniel made when he found that chamber. The Whitmore family's commitment to restitution had never wavered over 3 decades. Jennifer Whitmore had passed away 5 years earlier, but her children continued supporting the mill and the fund and the principle that inherited wealth came with inherited obligation to address how that wealth had been acquired. They understood they couldn't erase 4 generations of systematic theft, couldn't return stolen profit to people long dead, couldn't undo the compound effects of exploitation that had shaped families and communities. But they could acknowledge the debt, could work to address its ongoing impact, could ensure their family's story included truth rather than comfortable mythology. The anniversary celebration drew farming families from 5 states, historians and agricultural experts, students who'd studied the mill as a model for community truth-telling and restitution, journalists documenting how rural communities were reckoning with difficult economic histories. They toured the mill and the demonstration farm, watched grinding demonstrations and heritage agricultural practices, read displays that told both the practical story of grain processing and the ethical complexity of how the Whitmore mill had operated. As evening settled over the mill, as visitors departed and volunteers finished cleaning up, Daniel stood in the foundation chamber that had been sealed for 40 years before he'd found it. The space was preserved now, marked with interpretive signage explaining what Charles Whitmore had hidden and why, what Daniel had found and what choices had followed, what 3 decades of acknowledging systematic theft had created. Emma joined him, bringing Maya, who at 24 was finishing graduate work in agricultural economics and planned to return to the region to work on food security and farming sustainability. 3 generations stood together in the chamber that had changed everything, each of them shaped by what had been found here and what had followed from choices made when circumstances tested character. "Do you ever wish you'd just taken the money?" Maya asked, the same question Emma had asked years earlier, the question that each generation seemed to need answered directly rather than simply implied. Daniel considered this honestly, wanting to give his great-granddaughter truth rather than comfortable simplification. "Sometimes I think about how much easier things would have been if I'd just used it to solve our immediate crisis. But then I think about what that would have taught Emma, what kind of man I would have become, what message I would have sent about integrity being conditional on convenience." The answer is no. Finding that chamber, choosing to honor what Charles Whitmore intended, that gave me more than money could have provided. It gave me purpose and work that mattered and the knowledge that when circumstances tested my character, I chose right even when right was expensive. It gave us all something, Emma added. A legacy built on choice rather than inheritance, on integrity tested and maintained, on the principle that some things matter more than personal survival. Maya nodded, absorbing this. "I want to build on what you started. Use my degree to help farming communities address historical exploitation and present challenges, to create systems that support people rather than extracting from them. The mill taught me that's possible, that communities can face difficult truths and choose to address them rather than maintaining comfortable lies." They stood together in the chamber that had held secrets for 4 decades, in the mill that had been meant for salvage and had become legacy, in the building that had transformed through discovery and choice and decades of work honoring truth rather than perpetuating theft. Outside, the land stretched away in patterns that predated human claims, the creek still flowing in its ancient channel, the field still producing grain when worked with care. The mill would stand as long as its bones held, would tell its story to whoever came seeking to understand how systematic exploitation had operated and how eventually, through documentation and discovery and choice, truth had emerged and been honored. It would acknowledge Charles Whitmore's complicated legacy, would recognize the farming families who'd been exploited, would celebrate the choice Daniel had made to honor truth rather than take what he needed regardless of its source. 3 decades of steady work had created something that felt permanent, that felt essential to the community's identity and self-understanding. The mill was no longer just a building or even just a museum, but a living institution that served education and advocacy and the principle that difficult truths were better faced than buried. Daniel had bought that mill for $465, seeking salvage income that would keep him and Emma housed through one more desperate winter. He'd found instead a sealed chamber containing moral burden, testimony demanding that whoever found it choose between personal benefit and serving justice. He'd chosen justice, had honored Charles Whitmore's documented intentions, had demonstrated for Emma and eventually for Maya and for hundreds of students and visitors that integrity meant something even when the cost was everything you thought you needed. That choice had created ripples that extended across 3 decades, had influenced policy and education and community understanding about economic exploitation and restitution, had helped hundreds of farming families through the support fund, had preserved knowledge and practices that would otherwise have been lost, had shown that one person choosing right could create possibilities for communities to heal wounds that had festered across generations. As full darkness settled over the mill, as the last lights were turned off and doors were locked, Daniel walked to his truck with Rachel beside him, Emma and Maya following, for people whose lives had been shaped by what had been found in the foundation chamber and what had been built from that discovery. The mill stood behind them in the darkness, solid and purposeful, its story complete in the ways that mattered, not with neat resolution but with acknowledgement that truth eventually surfaced when people had courage to honor it. The land remembered everything, held every secret until the time came for revelation, gave up its buried things when desperation or determination or accident created conditions for truth to emerge. The chamber had been waiting, patient as only sealed spaces can be, holding testimony that demanded response from whoever was thorough enough to find it and brave enough to honor what it contained. Daniel had proven worthy not through perfection but through choice, through honoring what Charles Whitmore had intended rather than simply taking what would have solved his immediate crisis, through demonstrating that some inheritances came with obligations transcending personal benefit. The mill stood as proof that buried things eventually surfaced, that silence eventually broke, that truth mattered even when speaking it or honoring it cost everything you thought you needed. And 30 years later, that truth had created something far more valuable than the money Charles Whitmore had sealed away, a community that faced difficult history honestly, a fund that supported vulnerable families, a museum that educated thousands, a demonstration farm that preserved knowledge and practices, and 3 generations of a family that understood integrity was defined by choices made when circumstances tested character. That was legacy in its truest form. That was inheritance built through choice rather than received through accident. That was proof that sometimes desperate people stumbling into good fortune used it to honor something larger than their own survival. The mill would stand, the story would be told, the truth would be preserved for whoever came next seeking to understand how one man's sealed chamber and another man's choice had created possibilities nobody could have anticipated but that everyone could recognize as right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.